A farmer walks into the temple carrying a basket of fruit and recites a few carefully chosen words about his family's past. Those words would eventually leave the temple, enter the Jewish home, and become the centerpiece of the Passover Haggadah. Why did the rabbis choose this short declaration from Deuteronomy to tell the story of the Exodus? How does it make the Exodus personal and recurring? And why does it mention wandering ancestors, Egypt, slavery, redemption, and the land, but completely skip Mount Sinai? The rabbis were not alone in their fascination. Modern critical scholars have also recognized this unusual first-person declaration as an outlier in the Torah and a potential key to understanding how Israel shaped and reshaped its foundational story. Welcome to Madlik. My name is Jeffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on your favorite podcast platform and now on YouTube and Substack. We also publish a source sheet on Sefaria, and a link is included in the show notes. If you enjoy this podcast, be sure to subscribe and feel free to give us a star or two. This week we read Parshat Ki Tavo and encounter Mikra Bikkurim, a first-person script that begins the Exodus before Pharaoh and carries it forward into every generation. So, join us for liberation, personal, and recurring. Well, Rabbi, it's almost Rosh Hashanah and we're talking about Passover, as usual.
Perfect. You know what? That just shows the Jewish calendar goes round and round.
And I think maybe at the end we'll tie it into Rosh Hashanah. So if you're in a Rosh Hashanah state of mind, stick with us. So as I said, in Deuteronomy 26:1, it says, "When you enter the land that the Eternal your God is giving you as a heritage, and you possess it and settle it." I mean, that's what Deuteronomy is all about. Instructions for when you actually get into the land. "You shall take some of your first fruit of the soil, which you harvest from the land that the Eternal your God is giving you, put it in a basket, and go to the place where the Eternal your God will choose to establish the divine name. You shall go to the priest in charge at that time and say to him, I acknowledge this day before the Eternal your God that I have entered the land that God swore to our fathers to assign us. The priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down in front of the altar of the Eternal your God. You shall then recite as follows before the Eternal your God. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Eternal, the God of our ancestors, and the Eternal heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. God freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, and awesome power, and by signs and portents, bringing us to this place and giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And so I now bring the first fruits of the soil that you, O Eternal, has given me. You shall leave the basket before the Eternal your God and bow low before the Eternal your God. And you shall enjoy together with the Levite and the stranger in your midst all the bounty that the Eternal your God has bestowed upon you and your household." So the reason I say that this is, I'd say iconic, but also an outlier, and I try to emphasize the I, is because it really is a formula. Gerhard von Rad was a great biblical critical scholar, and he called this a little historical creed, or as he said in German, kleines geschriftes Credo. He believed it was an exceptionally early liturgical formula, subsequently incorporated into Deuteronomy. His argument rests on several observations. It has the compact form of an oral formula. Now, if you weren't following the screen, even in our translation translation, it puts the two statements in it in quotation marks. Rabbi, it really is a formula, kind of like a bracha that you would do today. You would hold up your bracha card in front of you or your siddur, and you would read from it. It's a quote. It's compact. The declaration reduces Israel's foundational story to a short sequence: an Aramean ancestor, descent into Egypt, multiplication into a nation, Egyptian oppression, Israel's cry, God's deliverance, entrance into the land. And for those of you who are knowledgeable with the Haggadah, if I had read it into Hebrew, you would have recognized it from the Haggadah, where every phrase becomes a touch point for a comment. It maintains no names, no dates, no genealogies, or narrative detail, says Van Rad. Because it's compressed, it has a rhythmical character as typical of something memorized and repeatedly recited in worship, rather than composed as an ordinary historical prose. It is also attached to a ritual. So these are all reasons that this scholar said there's something unique about this, and he thought it made it very old. And of course, we do have in the Torah, such as, correct me if I'm wrong, Rabbi, Oz Yoshir Moshe, which is the Song of the Sea, that scholars will say it seems to be older. It's a text that was brought in. And of course, the Torah itself makes references to Sefer Milchamot, Sefer Melachim. There is an understanding within even the Torah, even if you don't buy into biblical criticism and the fact that some editor came along, clearly it does references pre-existing phrases, formulas. And I think that's what he's kind of saying here. He thought this was very old.
Well, so that's for sure right. Az Yashir is like this recitation. It's not part of the story. It's not part of the narrative. It's separate from the narrative. Az Yashir comes in the middle. Here also, it's a recitation. Where does that come from? So that's kind of separate from the story.
Absolutely. It's like Oz Yoshir Moshe. They make it sound like this was a pre-existing song. Here, it's a pre-existing formula. But the other things that become fascinating, as we'll see, is it's written for the future, because it's a formula that Moses is giving to the people that they will say in the future, and they will recite themselves. The farmer is explicitly instructed to say these words while presenting the first fruits at the sanctuary, because first fruit offerings were presumed to be very old, Van Rad reasoned. That the accompanying recitation might also preserve an early cultic tradition. Clearly, in an agrarian society, the most basic thing that you do if you believe that God is responsible for any sort of success on your end is you thank God with your first fruits. It seems like it's a very seminal moment. He conceded that there was no objective chronological marker, but argued that the formula's concise, simple form and its connection to an ancient ritual brought it close to Israel's earliest formulations of its history. What makes it interesting is the formula moves from Exodus directly toward the land without mentioning Sinai, the covenant at Horeb, and without mentioning Moses. Sounds like when we talk about the Haggadah and we say, what's missing? Clearly in the Haggadah we say, doesn't mention Moses. I think this kind of sensitized me to say, it actually in the Haggadah doesn't mention giving the Torah at Mount Sinai either.
I think it's more significant that it doesn't mention Sinai, because we know that the book of Deuteronomy is basically first-person Moses. So he's the one who's telling them what to do. So it's not so surprising that Moses isn't there. But the fact that Sinai's not there, that's a good Dvar Torah for everybody's Seder.
Yeah. And of course, because Van Rad was a biblical critic, meaning to say that he felt that the Torah was comprised of edited documents put together at a later time, his argument was, why was it not mentioning Sinai? He argued that the Exodus land tradition, one group of texts, and the Sinai tradition, once circulated separately and were combined only later. You can buy it and you can take it or you can leave it. But the point point was that he clearly identified that Sinai was missing. And then he says, this thing about my father was an Aramean seems to preserve an unusual ancestral memory, which rings true because every year we twist our heads in our minds to know what's going on here. Who is this Armenian? It's old. The other commentaries, and I'm going to quote a little bit from Jeffrey Tigay, who wrote the JPS commentary on Devarim. He says the Hebrew Arami Oved Avi is alliterative. What does that mean? It has a repetition with the same starting sounds in a group of nearby words, which would facilitate memorization of this phrase. I've seen explanations before that say we use this Bikkurim because people knew it, because farmers used to use it.
Well, everything had to be memorized because, as Sharon will be happy to tell you, there were no books, and so you had to write it on parchment, and that was too expensive. So something like Arameo Vedavi had to be known, and of course that's why it's chosen for the Haggadah, because they didn't have Haggadahs in those days. These things had to be known to the people.
And the idea was that you were talking about your old ancestors that maybe you have forgotten. They were vulnerable migrants. They were poor people, and here you were celebrating the shefa, the richness of the moment. Makes perfect sense. He adds something else. He says that not only would this keep the memory of Israel's landless beginnings fresh in the farmer's mind, but he continues, this clause of saying that your forefather was an Aramean probably was very ancient, for it is unlikely that Israelite tradition would have chosen to describe Israel's ancestors as Arameans once Arameans of Damascus became aggressive toward Israel in the 9th century BCE. So again, there are many scholars, both critical or in the case of Jeffrey Tigay, more classical, more traditional, who are arguing that there's something unique about this, and it's possibly old. So
that's interesting about the historical point, about what the role of the Arameans was. Okay, anyway, all good. Let's see what they say.
So let's look at the classical rabbinic commentaries and who they say this wandering Aramean was. The Ibn Ezra says that it refers to Jacob. I think that's typically what we think of in the Haggadah because we see him fleeing from Laban. So he says that he was poor and had no money. So again, echoing what I said a second ago, that we will find later the Mishnah talks about going from Gnut, from maybe embarrassment, to Shvach, to being very successful. Here it's very simple. He was poor and had no money, and here you're bringing this basket of rich first crop. And it says, its import is, I did not inherit the land from my father, for my father was poor when he came to Aram. He was also a stranger in Egypt. He was few in number. The Rashbam says, Arami Oved Avi, he says, it means my father Avraham, who was an Aramite, lost in exile from his birthplace Aram. We dealt with this a lot in a very popular segment where we talked about the use of Aramaic, and everybody comes from Aram. The meaning of the word Oved here is similar. The root used to describe wandering without specific objective, almost like walking because one is lost. We also find the word in this connection in Jeremiah. My people were lost sheep, their shepherd led them astray. Amiroim Tatuim. I find the reference to Jeremiah important because remember that Jeremiah is a prophet in the future of exile and return. And so just as our forefathers were lost, exile, wandering, so too when we bring up that basket of first fruits, we're referring in the instance where sometime in the future will be again refugees. We come from refugees. Don't worry about it. You can get over it. And then, of course, I love the Shadal.
And by the way, that the word, my father was a wandering Aramean. So we always focus on the word Aramean, but the word wandering is a very interesting term, right? That my father was a wanderer. That's what you say. We're always refugees.
And we're always referring to that in good times and bad. And I think that's powerful. Shadal says, my father, this includes all the patriarchs as one, for they wandered from nation to nation. And he says, the Rashbam, who said it was Abraham, was on the right track. What I'm trying to get to, Rabbi, very similar to what we did last week with Isaiah, where he tried to broaden our history to Noah, to Adam and Eve, to Abraham and Sarah. Here it's becoming irrelevant who we're referring to with this ambiguous term Aramean, because its import is that it could be any one of our relatives. It could be any one of our patriarchs and ancestors. And that's why I love that Shadal says it's all of them. It takes away the historical antecedents of one Exodus, of one leader, of Moses, and it broadens it out. And I think that too makes it much more important.
Fantastic.
And now, a word from our sponsor. If there's one thing we value at Matlik Podcast, it's reading texts and talking about them. That's why I'm excited to share something I created called Voice Gift Play. It fits in the palm of your hand like a remote control and clips onto any book. It's inspired by those old school museum audio guides, but this is personal. Voice Gift Play stores up to 10 hours of audio across 999 numbered recordings. You simply enter a number to record a comment, memory, or explanation, and enter the same number to play it back. It's perfect for B'nai Mitzvah practicing their laning, capturing Grandpa's favorite tune, or recording Chad Gad Yah in a voice that matters. Go to voice.gift. That's www.voice.gift and use code MADLIK for 15% off. Thanks. And now back to our podcast. So the Exodus prototype precedes Egypt. It doesn't start with Egypt. It goes farther back. And I think that if you argue with those who argue that this is an older text, even as some who say that the present declaration belongs to the late monarchic or exilic Deuteronic period, or others who propose reading it in relation to returning exiles and those who had remained in the land, it makes perfect sense. I love the fact that almost the rabbis and the biblical critics are saying this statement becomes so useful because it's not relational to one particular period. It could be very old, or it could be literally at the moment that Isaiah, who we were reading last week, was talking.
Right. Well, and of course, and we use it every year at the Seder. So it's above time.
It is, and I love that you brought that up, because I'm going to segue now into the Seder, because I'm going to argue today, and we do this many times at Madlik, where we say, the biblical critics and the rabbis definitely recognize the same problems, and in this particular case, they came out with the same solution. So the rabbis of the Haggadah are writing a document. Most of us would agree it was made for exile. It certainly was made for a post-temple time. They didn't need a Haggadah when you were bringing your Passover sacrifice. But they wrote it for transitional periods, and they went and picked this same ceremonial, formulaic statement that a farmer says when he brings his crops, and they modeled the whole Haggadah after it. So this is what they say in the Mishnah in Pesachim. He begins, Matchil Bignut U'Mesayim B'Shvach. He begins with the Jewish people's disgrace. I would say better, humble beginnings. I don't know why we say disgrace, and concludes with their glory. He expounds from the passage, an Aramean tried to destroy my father. That's Deuteronomy 26:5. And here the Mishnah is telling us what to do at the Seder, at the moment of Magid, that we are required to tell the story. The declaration one recites when presenting the first fruits in the temple, until he concludes explaining the entire section. So that's that's why we are discussing Passover today, because it is literally our paragraph in the Torah portion of this week that provides the basis, the proof text that we use in the Haggadah. In terms of the traditional Talmudic explanations of what it means to begin with Ganai, with what I call our humble beginnings, Rav says it's idolatry, and Shmuel says it's slavery. But again, if you look at the context, it's clear as any entrepreneur who is successful and talks back to his humble beginnings that this is part of this wonderful formula. I started, my dad had nothing, and this is what God gave me and created this wonderful
I'll
shefa.
just say that Jewish tradition to always go back to our humble beginnings, I wonder if that comes from the Haggadah. That's just part of our DNA, that's our tradition, that you start from our humility.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's very powerful, but we think of it so many times as something, it's kind of the right thing to do. But I think what we're going to take away today is, but it's a powerful, empowering thing to do. Because if your beginnings are humble and you were a wanderer, guess what? If you're a wanderer again, you're going to take solace from that. You're going to say, I've been here before. I've seen this movie, and I know we can get out of it. So again, the key question is, why not go to the book of Exodus to base the Haggadah on? Why go to Deuteronomy? And the answer seems to be that in Exodus, it contains all the details of the events. But Deuteronomy contains a speech in which an Israelite is commanded to retell those events. Exodus is third-person narrative. The Israelites were enslaved. God heard them. God brought them. But here it's first person. He saw us. And look what it comes right from the Haggadah. V'yarotanu b'Mitzrayim, v'nitzak, v'yotzienu, v'yavinu. It happened to me, says this farmer. It brings it into the present. And that's, of course, what the next Mishnah says. B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lerot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. Therefore, each person, and they took that right from the farmer, because the farmer is standing there reciting a formula that Moses provided in the book of Deuteronomy on the banks of Moab, that he was to say in the future to relive the moment. I think it's magical.
It's fantastic. Well, that's the most famous line of all, right? We have to imagine that we left Egypt. We have to imagine ourselves as slaves, and we have to imagine ourselves as achieving our freedom.
Yes, and of course, it therefore tells the next most famous thing, which is that therefore we need to look it upon ourselves as we went out, and then it goes on and learn from Laban, and it says, therefore we went down to Egypt and resided there, just a handful of souls, and there we became a nation, large and plenty. It feeds right into the story of the Haggadah. And I would say that it becomes now very similar to what we were stretching for last week. And this becomes, therefore, an outlier for another reason. If you recall, last week we said, you'll never find Moses talking about Abraham. You'll never find Moses besides the covenant. You'll never find him talking or referencing Noah. You'll never find him talking or reference Adam and Eve. But here, by using this word Aramean, which is in the book of Deuteronomy, it opens up permission for us to say this story goes way back, and as a result, and this is key, it goes way forward, that it will be with us all the time. And that's why we can say, V'hi she'amda, that it is in every generation that they stand up against us. That's literally what it's saying. It's saying that the Exodus story was not a one-off. The Exodus story was a model, a template that we can repurpose going forward. So it's, I think, fascinating to look at this in the context of what we were discussing last week with regard to Isaiah.
Yeah, that is actually fantastic, right? To look forward, to look backwards. Yeah, I mean, the question to me is, why is it that we need to see it as if we left Egypt? What do we gain by by acting as if we were slaves and we were free? I think it means that we appreciate Jewish history. And that's what Isaiah is, right? That if we understand that experience of going from slavery to freedom, then we fit into every period of Jewish history. B'chol dor vador, in every generation.
I totally agree. And what I'm trying to say, I guess, is we know when Isaiah lived. Isaiah lived at, some of what he wrote, he might have written even in Babylon, and some when he came back to Israel and was hoping that others would follow him. The rabbis, we know when they wrote the Haggadah. It was after the temple was destroyed, probably even after the Jews were exiled from the land. So imagine the audacity of picking a paragraph that a farmer who farms the Holy Land, the Promised Land, says, and you're asking a community that is no longer in that land to take power from it. But again, what it shows is that the power of these phrases were literally not for when we saw the liberation or were living the liberation, but when we were backward sliding into some sort of golah or exile. And I think that's, therefore, I would even say that almost gives a little bit of strength to the argument that this might have been written at the same time as Isaiah or edited and brought in the same time as Isaiah.
That supports that idea.
But certainly, whether you buy into that or not, it becomes powerful in those instances. And I think that is what makes it Lodor Vador. It makes it something that transcends a particular moment or a particular time. And of course, what that means is that the rabbis take it from the temple to the home, from the pilgrim's basket to the Seder table, from possession of the land to life in dispersion. It makes it so much more powerful going forward. And I think that to me, this convergence of criticism, biblical criticism, and the rabbinic interpretation really proves to me that there aren't really any conflicts here, that we can look at these timeless texts and we can look at them hafach ba from every different perspective, and we come out many times with the same language. But at the end of the day, all of these texts give us a grammar, and the grammar has two components to it. On the one hand, it's personal. I emphasized when I read the text how it says I. It is a single individual farmer. And the other part is because it separates it from a particular Exodus, from a particular Moses or a Jacob or an Isaac or an Abraham, it means that it's a recurring pattern. It doesn't really matter who the key players are, because in every generation, it has meaning for us. So this first-person script is something that we started by saying makes it unique, but it becomes very important. And the recurring pattern. I think this idea of Bikkurim, too, is important. It wasn't done on a particular holiday. There's an open season, so to speak, for bringing Bikkurim. This wasn't the kind of Bikkurim that we think of on Shavuot. It is Bikkurim that was brought whenever you got those new crops. You were empowered then to come to the place that God chose and present these gifts. So I think it's a wonderful, wonderful message.
A fantastic message. It's really, really good. And connecting it to Isaiah and what we've done the past 2 weeks is also wonderful. This is week number 6 in the 7 Haftorahs.
Yes. So now I want to get back to the open question that Van Rad opened, which is, what about Sinai? Why do we not mention Sinai, therefore, in the Haggadah? Why do we not mention Sinai in the Bikkurim formula? Sinai is so important. Even in the Haggadah, you might say we do mention it in the Dayenu. We say, had you not given us the Torah, would it have been enough? But ultimately, there is is an article in thetorah.com that literally asks this question, and it comes up with numerous answers, none of which I find particularly appealing. It seems to me, Rabbi, and this I'm going to go out on a limb, and I want to know what you think. I think that while Exodus repeats itself over and over again, this kind of revelation at Sinai might have been a one-off. In other words, we don't want prophets coming and making new laws. The law was given at Sinai once. Yes, we re-listened to that law, but that moment where we had this kind of a public opening up of heaven and getting God's opinion, getting God's laws.
Happens only once.
It happens once, and it's unlike Exodus, where we can make the case that it can become very personal, I. We argue against private epiphany. We don't want a Paul walking on the way somewhere and saying, hey, I just got this great text from God. It's going to change. And I think that the rabbis understood that in the famous Talmud of Achnai. They said, Lo b'shamayim he, quoting Deuteronomy, the Torah is not in heaven. They said, Rabbi Yirmiyahu says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard any divine voices anymore. It's nitna libnei Adam. So maybe that is the answer of why Sinai is not connected. And I'll go one step further, because I did promise to tie things into Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, right after we give this iconic paragraph that's used to get teshuvah, that gets us
repentance,
absolved. Yeah. Adoshem. In the Slichot, we say, we have all sinned, aval anachnu va'avotenu chatanu. Again, there we're using this same tool, which is to say that we've been sinning from time immemorial. We are sinning before, we're sinning today, and we're going to sin in the future. And we know how to deal with this. We were giving tools to deal with this. I think it's the same type of comforting context where we connect ourselves with the past that gives us power into the future.
I think that's great. I'll just say that, this declaration is very much tied into bringing us to the land. Sinai is important, but Sinai is like a parallel train track to going into the land. Sinai is independent. You're obligated to keep the law even outside the land. Going into the land is something else. So I think also, in light of what you said, I think we understand that. Sinai is something else. This is about getting into the land.
Perfect. So anyway, another Shabbat as we get ready for Rosh Hashanah and Passover, but one which really teaches us these timeless tools that the Torah provides a people in order to repurpose stories from the past, traditions from the past, laws and truths from the past to give us strength today and into the future.
Fantastic. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. We'll see you next week. We're getting close to the end of the Torah. Be well, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom. Do you agree that the Exodus repeats itself while Sinai happened only once? Or do you believe that revelation can also occur in our personal lives? I'd love to hear your thoughts, disagreements, and questions in the comments section. Please also share other questions about Jewish texts and traditions that you'd like us to explore in future Madlik Deep Dive.